I'm Jeff Ginter with Real Progressives. Thanks for watching MMT Mondays. Tonight, a special treat. Ellis Winningham and Steve Grumbine used to every Sunday do MMT lessons. They would talk MMT. They would dive really deep into various concepts. And I want to resurrect one of these. And it's basically MMT 101. This is a two-part for MMT Mondays. I like to keep things about an hour. I'll go a little bit over. But this was a 2-hour episode back in the day when they first broadcast this. So I'm splitting it up. You know, an hour tonight and an hour next week. And I'm putting this in now because every now and again I think it's really time for us to take a beat and really remind ourselves what we're talking about. What is modern monetary theory? From soup to nuts, what is it? And Ellis does an amazing job of taking us through this process. So sit back, enjoy, take notes, keep this one bookmarked. You know, you maybe want to share this around with some other friends that are having some basic questions about modern monetary theory. This should clear up a lot of their confusion. I'll be back at the end. Bye-bye.
All right, folks, this is Steve with Real Progressives. I am getting ready to bring Ellis Winningham on. We are going to be doing a lengthy, in-depth review from soup to nuts of modern monetary theory. This is going to be worth taking notes for. This is going to be worth paying attention to. This is very, very important in the long-term movement. This is going to be something for you to refer to later on as you go into the world trying to activate this knowledge. So with that, let me just say this before we get too far down the road. Real Progressives is supposed to represent 7 knowledge areas. Those 7 knowledge areas are economic justice, environmental and ecological justice, peace with justice, democracy, equality with justice, health and nutrition, and lastly, technology and innovation. Now, let me just state for the record that the reason why you see MMT so much at Real Progressive is because not one goddamn thing that I just mentioned before this can happen in a way that would be progressive in the least without a thorough knowledge of the economics that will enable each of those things to happen. Now, each one of you has seen the Democratic Party sell you worthlessly how they're going to pay for things. And they always talk about, we got to tax to find money. We got to find money somewhere. We got to cut something. We got to do this, that, or the other. And guess what? It's a freaking lie. It's a lie. It's not a lie. It's a brazen lie. And you're suffering as a result of that lie. The United States government can do an awful lot more than it's doing today, and it continues to lie to its citizens. And our goal here at Real Progressives is to enable progressive policies in all of those knowledge areas with a cornerstone. Every single piece of that rests on understanding the economic way of delivering each one of them. Now, there are a lot of news outlets out there. There's a lot of alternative news outlets out there that focus on current events, that focus on providing opinion pieces. Let me just tell you for the record, Real Progressives is not really too terribly concerned with a lot of like non-solutions based opinion pieces. Head knowledge does us no good whatsoever. We've been just slaughtered with head knowledge, right? And nothing freaking changes. The differentiator with Real Progressives and all the other ones is we are literally focused every step along the way on delivering the solutions that will produce a progressive agenda, a progressive revival, something for us to unite around. All the rest of it is pure and utter distraction. And if we don't get it right today, in 2 years, in 4 years, you will be stuck with the same stupid, uneducated, progressive leaders telling you the same stupid, repulsive lies about taxes, funding, spending, etc. And we will not get anything passed because outside of the bubble that progressives live in is this thing called the GOP. And outside this progressive bubble is this thing called LOL Libertarians. And outside of this progressive bubble is this thing called Vote Blue sycophants. And outside this progressive bubble is a bunch of businesses and other things that don't want us to get what we deserve. So when you think about paying for stuff with taxes, which is a lie, just remember the only hope you have of any revival whatsoever is through modern monetary theory. So without further ado, let me bring Ellis Winningham on to talk about MMT 101. Ellis, you're on, sir.
How you doing, Steve?
Oh, I'm doing good. Thank you for allowing me that moment to make sure people understood the stakes of the game here so they don't just go, oh, that silly econ thingy. So
that silly econ.
That's right. So this is anything but silly. It should be considered life-giving. It should be considered manna from heaven. And quite frankly, it should be memorized, learned, educated, absorbed, embedded into every aspect of our political lives. So without further ado, Ellis, I'm going to open your window, make you large and in charge.
Hey, it's not the way it's supposed to be. Well, sorry about the lighting, first of all. You know, there's only so much light that's available. You know, otherwise I'd have to tax or borrow to get more lighting. But other than that, you know, we're going to use the board here a little bit, and we're going to talk about MMT, MMT 101, and we're going to weave some macroeconomics into it. So at the end of this entirety, this thing here, we should have a concise little show where people who are new can come and get the basics and the fundamentals, not only of MMT, but of how the economy works. You know, the fundamentals, get a lot of their questions answered, get a lot of light bulbs coming on, and give them a foundation for them to move forward in their knowledge if they want to pursue that, or if they would just prefer to be a more informed citizen, better informed citizen. You know, that's the ultimate goal anyway. So I thought it would be a good idea to just do this and get it out of the way. We've got MMT here and MMT there. You know, sometimes we'll do the Sunday shows, we'll talk about taxes, or we'll talk about deficits of this. Here we get everything just in one show. You know, and then Steve can cut it down and do what he wants to do with it, you know, and I can go have a sleep. And we'll get some knowledge out to people and get a better informed public and get the ball rolling in the right direction, hopefully. All right, so where shall we begin, Stephen? With the board or with your coffee?
Well, right now my coffee is going down my throat, so let's go ahead and start with the board.
Tilt. Well done. You know, I had this thing all set up. I was in a perfect position. You could even see my belt. I could walk back and forth. And then Steve said, the board is really small. You're going to have to move right up against the wall till you can't move. I said, all right. All right. So let's begin with what MMT is not. Ready? MMT is not trickle-down economics. MMT is not deficit spending. Okay? MMT simply is. It is a description of how the monetary system works. In other words, it's not a theory. We're just describing how dollars enter the economy, how they exit the economy, how users use the dollar, how currency issuers issue, why they issue, what drives the dollar, okay? This is what MMT is. It's a description. I've said this before, I'll say it again. If you want to liken it to something, MMT is like describing a modern piano. Well, it has 88 keys. That's MMT, okay? It's not a theory. It's just an accurate description of how the dollar works, or how the British pound works, or how the Australian dollar works, for that matter, okay? MMT can also describe and also does describe the European Monetary Union. Okay? It also describes the gold standard. It just is currency analysis. It looks at currency, it says, here's how it works, and then from there, we can derive proper macroeconomic policy because it creates a framework for us to do so, because we begin grounded in reality, not in fantasy land, as the mainstream enjoy, like an oxygen tent, I suppose. You know, DSGE oxygen tent over here. Oh, there's only one person in the economy and there's no money. That's how the economy works. All right, well, no. All right, so we begin from the very beginning. Those of you who have gone a little bit into MMT, you're with us. This is going to seem boring at first, but you know, you might need a refresher. For those new people, welcome. We're going to look at the United States because that's what we're talking about today. So the subject today will be the United States of America. So it'll be the US government and the US dollar. Here we see a dollar symbol on the board behind me. This is called a unit of account. There, a unit of account. Here's another one. This is a British pound. Okay? What's the difference between these two symbols? Huh? The difference is one is in the United Kingdom and the other one's in the United States. Okay? The major issue that you need to understand coming right out of the gate is that the private sector doesn't issue the British pound. The private sector doesn't issue the US dollar. Okay? This is a product of the government of the United Kingdom. And this is a product of the United States government. Since we're not talking about the United Kingdom, we'll get that out of there. US dollar, the unit of account. Only the US government has the authority to issue the US dollar. Now, there are, say, commercial banks who create their own IOU, bank credit money. And there's various other forms of monetary instruments going all the way down to little tokens, you know, to play video games. But the greatest of all monetary instruments in the United States is the US dollar, which is issued exclusively by the US government. US Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. Okay? Power to tax and the power to issue the dollar. All right, great. So, remember, unit of account, US government. Unit of account, national government. Always the issuer. Okay? It has a monopoly. That's important too to understand. This means that no one else is allowed. This means that the mainstream sphere of China lending the US government its own money is impossible because the US government has infinite issuance capacity of its own currency. In this case, the US dollar again. All right. So, what does this mean? Infinite issuance capacity. First thing is first. There is no gold standard. So, there are no gold reserves to defend. The US dollar is not attached to any fixed exchange regime. It is fiat. That means that the government issues the dollar at will whenever it spends. When the US government wants something, it simply credits a bank account somewhere and spends dollars into existence. That's fiat. Okay? During a gold standard, you had to tax and you had to borrow to defend the gold supply. There's nothing to defend in a fiat regime. So, the dollar, again, is a monopoly product of the US government. And because it's the monopoly product of the US government alone has the exclusive right not only to issue, to regulate the economy that uses it. The question starts off with beginners. When they hear MMT say, well, you know, federal taxes don't fund federal spending, meaning the federal government doesn't go out and look for income so that it can spend. The first question that newbies, new people, ask is, well, if taxes don't fund spending, what's the purpose of taxation? I'm glad you asked, because it's very important. You see, In a fiat regime, federal taxation has several important jobs. None of them, though, is to provide the US government with an income source. Because Article 1, Section 8 again, US Constitution, US government is the sole issuer of the unit of account, which is the US dollar. Now, let's look at how taxation works. What's the first purpose of federal taxation? Well, this is going to be the fun part. It's why we use the US dollar in the United States. Now, I have had some people come to me, many years now, some on the right wing, and they'll say, well, you know, we use the US dollar because it's our money. In other words, we use it because we're patriotic. No. Okay. We use the US dollar because the government forces us to. Oh, be still, libertarians, calm down. It'll be all right. This is a good kind of force. All right. It's better than being beaten over the head and impressed into federal service, isn't it? All right. So here's how we do it. Once upon a time, there was a private sector, and it was operated by the British government. But then the British lost the United States. And the US won this Revolutionary War, and it decided to form its own government. And along came the US government. And the US government said something funny. It said, excuse me, I am going to declare a tax. And everybody looked at the government and said, oh, you are? Yes, I am. And it is only payable in US dollars. People go, well, what are US dollars? We don't have any of that. We have British pounds. Yes, well, I won't accept those. And there's a punishment for this tax, too. You don't pay it, I'm going to do bad things to you. So the people became really frightened, both business and workers. And they said, well, how are we going to pay the tax if we don't have these US dollars? The government says, don't worry, I'll give them to you. I'll give you tax credits. Then you can pay your taxes. But the thing is I need some things. And so the private sector looks at the government and it says, what do you need? What do you need? It says, well, I'm government. I'm going to need tables, chairs, wood, carpet, you know, all sorts of stuff. If you'd like, you could just sell them to me. And then I'll give you the US dollars in exchange, and then you can pay your taxes. But because the US government is a monopoly issuer of currency, guess what it gets to do? It gets to determine the price that it's willing to pay for objects and goods and services in its own currency. So it basically tells the market as it comes and says, here's a table. The government says, well, I think I shall pay $10 for that table. You see, the market doesn't get to decide. The government does, because it's the price setter. It's the monopoly issuer. Everybody needs the monopolist's dollars in order to pay the tax. So they're willing to take whatever the monopolist is going to give them. Okay? So, at the moment of taxation, guess what happens? Suddenly, a lot of people who don't own businesses say, oh shit, I have to pay a tax, and I don't have the dollars. Guess what they are? They're unemployed, Stephen. Because taxation creates unemployment. Not in this trickle down nonsense. You know, I'm going to really hit these trickle down, MMT is trickle down people. I'm really going to give them a bust in the chops, all right? Because this is going to stop, all right? The tax, in this case, creating unemployment, is in the sense that the government is demanding a currency. It's demanding US dollars in exchange to pay these taxes. Okay? And the people can't pay it because they don't have the dollars. But now they're actively seeking employment to obtain these dollars because the government is buying goods and services to supply itself. It's provisioning itself. Okay? So, since the government has created some unemployment, it's willing to hire these workers because it not only needs goods, but it needs services, it needs labor. So it hires them as well. Okay? In other words, what we're saying is federal taxes, in the first instance, drive the currency. They're what creates the demand and the ongoing demand. And federal taxes drive goods and services to the public sector. You see that? When the federal government taxes, this causes goods and services to go from the private sector to the public sector. In other words, it allows government to provision itself with the goods and the services that it needs to function as government. And the reason why the founding fathers said the US government will issue its own dollar, it will issue its own money, and we're going to put that in the Constitution is simply because of this. The government can issue its currency at will, and because it can do that, it can ensure that it can always purchase the goods and services that it needs without fear of going broke. How about that? Okay, so point one, federal taxes drive the currency. They drive the demand for the US dollar. Okay, two, they drive goods and services from the private sector to the public sector. Causes people to sell their goods and sell their labor to the government in exchange for the government's currency so it can pay the tax. Okay, good. Now, some fun stuff. We're going to look a little bit deeper into how the US government buys these goods and services, because it's very important. As we said, the government lays a tax, payable only in US dollars with a punishment, and then it goes out to enforce its tax collections. When those goods and services are sold to the government then injects its currency into the economy by paying for those goods and services. Okay? This becomes a perpetual thing. From that point on, the government not only sets the price of goods and services and can control them, but the government also determines the unemployment rate. That's right. The US government controls the unemployment rate in the US. It's 100% in control. Whenever you see involuntary unemployment, it's because the deficit's too low. We're going to talk about that later. But firstly, as we said, federal taxes drive the currency, okay? So they create a demand. I'm going to put this down on the board here if this would work. Okay, so federal taxes in the first instance create a demand for the US dollar. As long as the US government can enforce its tax collections, people will demand the US dollar, okay? In the US, people are going to say, well, I got to have it, okay? So as long as you know you're going to lose your house, your car, or you're going to go to jail if you don't pay your taxes, you're going to get a hold of US dollars, right? Now, the second thing that federal taxes do is they control spending power. Hope you all can see that. Yeah, okay. So the second thing they do is they control spending power. When the government raises taxes, this takes dollars out of your pocket, dollars that you could have spent on something, right? And as a result, you can spend less. So if you have $1,200 in the bank and the government comes along and takes away $500 in tax, you have $500 less to spend. Now, if you do that across the macroeconomy on aggregate, you reduce consumer spending. Now, how about that? They control inflation, see? So that's what we really mean. When we say controlling spending power, federal taxes can be employed to control inflationary pressure. All right, that's great. Third, federal taxes alter behavior. I spelled behavior with a U. Federal taxes alter behavior that society says, well, we just don't want to see this anymore. I'll give you a perfect example. Let us suppose that the United States were a tiny little country and its roads were very small, okay? And people said, well, you know, there are too many cars in this, you know, everything is just so congested and there's so many cars. We need to control the number of cars on the road. How could we do that? Well, the government could say, here's what we'll do. we'll put a 100% tax on new car purchases in order to discourage cars. Okay? People now have to pay an exorbitant fee just to buy a car. I mean, it's a very expensive thing. So they look for alternative ways, maybe bicycles or motorcycles, or maybe they take public transportation more now. Goal has been achieved, behavior has been altered. Perfect example of what I'm talking about, another one, cigarettes. When the government imposed a cigarette tax, it wasn't trying to fund Medicare. It was trying to control smoking. It was trying to reduce the number of smokers in the United States to decrease the unnecessary burden on the healthcare system. See? And so when we jack the price of cigarettes up, eventually it goes out of reach of some people's affordability, and though they're addicted, some people say, screw it, I quit. Now, the poor people are going to be hit the hardest, you know. But on the whole, people will continue to smoke. However, smoking has been reduced to some degree. That's because the tax is altering behavior. So that's another thing that federal taxes do. So first they create a demand for the US dollar. That's why we use the dollar, to avoid punishment for not paying the tax. So that the government can control inflationary pressure, control spending power, 3, alter behavior. Okay? These are the main purposes of federal taxation. Notice that there's nothing about funding spending here. There's nothing. That's because the US government doesn't need an income. We've already said there is no gold standard. And so if there's no gold standard, that means there's no gold reserves to defend. Why was that important? Well, if we recall from the last show that Steve and I did on the gold standard, we talked a little bit about this. During a gold standard, the government would take its currency, its dollar, and it would peg it to gold. In other words, what it would do is it would determine that $1 was equal to so many ounces of gold. Okay? And this required the government to have a gold supply on hand so that it could exchange gold for a dollar on demand. Right? That's how you get the gold standard to work. And so it had to defend those gold reserves. And there's 2 ways it could do that. It would have to tax or borrow if it wanted to spend. The reason why is because I used the example, if $1 were worth 1 pound of gold, and you had 600 billion pounds of gold, you could only have $600 billion in the economy, and no more, because you had just enough to exchange. Okay. The way to avoid decreasing or increasing the amount of dollars available would be to tax or to borrow. If it wanted a debt spend, it would borrow. See? But with fiat, there's no gold. There's no peg. There's no currency peg. There's no gold. There's nothing attached to the dollar. The government can only issue it at will, whenever it spends. Okay? And for those of you who are new and saying, what do you mean, we're going to print money? No, we'll get to printed cash in a little bit. Answer that question. But the US government, like the British government, like the Canadian government, the Japanese government, the Australian government, when they spend, when these governments spend, they're actually creating money. It's money creation in action. When the government decides to buy something, it creates the money to buy it. It doesn't take it from you. It doesn't need it because it gave it to you in the first place. We're going to talk about that too in a little bit. How are we doing so far, Stephen?
We are doing excellent, sir. Can I ask you, you kind of went through some really important stuff there.
Yeah.
You have one question that keeps coming up, and it might fit within the whole story here so that you can kind of put this one to bed. The question comes in about the 16th Amendment, of the ability to levy tax and all the rigmarole that goes around with that.
What about it?
Good question. It's, I think a certain sect of the population has got conspiracy theories all over them. Exactly.
Article 1, Section 8 is much older than the 16th Amendment, and it says the U.S. government shall have the power to levy taxes.
So why do you suspect?
Well, you know, people, sounds to me like the libertarians.
That's what I'm seeing too. I think of Ron Paul.
Taxes, yeah, Ron Paul, taxes are theft.
Right.
Well, if you go back further into the Constitution than the 16th Amendment, which appeared much later in U.S. history, when you go back to the actual founding of the nation, the founding fathers did Article 1, Section 8, and said the Congress shall have the power to levy taxes. Oh dear. Whoops. So, you know, no, taxation's not theft, and here's why. If the government is not taking your private property and you're paying your taxes, you know, if you're paying your taxes with your US dollars and it's not taking your car, if it's not taking your shoes, guess what? It's not theft. The government issues the currency, and that's where we were getting ready to go. The government injects currency. It gives you the dollar to pay your taxes. The dollar is a tax credit. See? So, fact, over here on one hand, you have a tax. And it is for $1,000. That's a negative number. That's a negative number. Ah, you can't see that. These lights suck, Stephen. Sorry about that. Okay, so over here you have a $1,000. You have a $1,000 tax. That's a negative number because it's a tax. It's a tax on you. The government's saying, you're going to pay this. And you say, oh, God. Okay. All right. So then the government throws some money in. Remember, it was buying things. Taxation does what? It creates unemployment. People have jobs now. They're seeking employment and they start earning dollars. And the market is selling its goods and services to the U.S. government in exchange for those dollars. Excellent. So now there's dollars in the economy. They're tax credits. Here's why. When you apply $1,000, when you apply $1,000 to a $1,000 liability, the answer is zero. It cancels the tax liability. The government takes the dollar and destroys it. That's it. Destroys it. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is, if the government's going to tax you and US dollars don't exist, then the issuer is going to have to give you the means to pay that tax. They're called US dollars. Only the government, the federal government, issues the tax and then declares that it's payable in its own currency. Taxation is not theft. Taxation is the way the government takes control of the market, takes control of the nation, regulates it as the currency issuing and regulatory authority. By issuing the US dollar, it's giving you the means to pay your taxes. There is no such thing as a private sector dollar. Now, if you saw Fidel's show the other day, it was an excellent show. On Tuesday night, was it, Stephen? I think it was. Yes. Now, if you saw what Fidel said there, he said that many people operate under the assumption that the private sector came up with the concept of money, and then the government just joined in later on and had to have an income. Okay? That's not what happened. That's not the history of money. Okay? National governments issue the currency, and they tax. They tax so that they can issue a currency. Okay, so like I said, the US dollar is a tax credit. You use it to pay your taxes, and it's the only thing that the government will accept to extinguish those tax liabilities. So if you have $1,000 on hand, you have 1,000 tax credits. If your tax is $1,000 and you give the government those 1,000 tax credits, your tax liability is zero. But if you try and give it baby food or wool or gold, you're still going to have a $1,000 liability. And the government's going to tell you eventually you're going to be late on your taxes if you don't hurry up and get some US dollars. Okay? So I hope that answers the question about the 16th Amendment.
In spades, sir. In spades. Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Let's roll.
Let's
Tell
do
me
it.
where your people want to go next, or I can just design this thing on the fly and ad-lib this thing right through here.
So let's go to the next phase, right?
Sure.
The fact is that the United States has been on several different setups over the course of its existence. Before the Federal Reserve came in, we had a bunch of crazy banknotes all over the place, different IOUs from different banks. Sometimes $1 from one bank wasn't equal to $1 in another bank. It was based on credit worthiness and a lot of corruption. And then the U.S. finally said, "Hey guys, we're just sick and tired of all the insanity and all the friggin' corruption. We're going to go ahead and standardize this thing so we have some logical, efficient means of transfer within the nation." But talk through the process from which we came to have to do this, because obviously the biggest hurdle we have to deal with is the Dungeons and Dragons Club that talks about the creature from Jekyll Isle and so forth.
Yeah, the Fed, isn't that wonderful? The unelected Fed that's coming to eat us alive, and it's got the U.S. government at its knees, even though it's the nation's central bank. Go figure. But anyway, yeah, you got it. These banks would issue their own currency, or their own money, excuse me, and they would say, "Oh well, here's the Bank of
Winningham."
The banks of Salmon Sons, and this is a Salmon Son dollar, and it, it would only be worth maybe 50 cents to a Bank America buck, and occasionally you'd get banks going out, they collapse, you get runs, banks would just go bust, and if you had any savings, and it was all in the Bank of Grumbine's dollars, and the Bank of Grumbine went out, well, you're poor. You have nothing. Yeah, so, what helps here? What would help is if these banks that are issuing their own IOUs, what if we could clear them all on par with $1? Well, you can do that when you have a central bank called the Federal Reserve. Okay? Isn't that neat? Now, remember what we said. The U.S. government itself is the currency issuing authority. So we're going to talk, first of all, about how government spends today. All right? And then we're going to show, with the Federal Reserve involved here on the board, we're going to show how the Federal Reserve plays a part in all this to make sure that when you swipe your debit card at Walgreens or Walmart, that what you bought, you get to take home, because the payment will clear. All right? It's not as much of a conspiracy as these, the AMI people and the Fed people and the Ron Paul and Rand Paul crazy people they like to talk about. What's really strange about Rand Paul and Ron Paul is that there they are, and at one time Ron was in Congress for so long, and Rand's there, and they still haven't figured out, even though they could just travel right over to the Board of Governors and talk to them. They haven't figured out that the Board of Governors is an agency of the U.S. government yet. Yes, that's interesting. They either have not figured it out, or they just don't care to admit that they have a political agenda. I think isn't that the truth? It's a political agenda. I think it is, yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, how does the U.S. government spend? Well, we got this thing called Congress that sucks, and it's filled with people. The House of Representatives we start with, they're the ones that control spending. And the House of Representatives sit down like this, and they say, what shall we do this year? They say, let's create a budget. So what are we going to buy? Well, we're going to buy all sorts of things, and we're going to fund all sorts of things. And they'll argue back and forth, and they'll work out something. It's what we call a budget. Okay. Now, the term federal budget is asinine. When you attach the word budget to the federal government, it doesn't really make any sense, because it implies that there's only a limited amount of income there, funds that can be spent by Congress. It's not true at all. But we'll get to that later. Point being is that they sit down on the dust and they say, let's buy stuff. Let's fund stuff, and let's not fund this, and let's fund this. Okay? They said, okay, great. In the Senate, they'll say something, the president will say something. Eventually, everybody's happy, and they sign off on this thing, and you have a budget. And let's assume that this fiscal year, the Congress said, we shall spend $4 trillion, and we'll tax $2 trillion. Okay? So our budget is going to be, we're going to deficit spend $2 trillion this year. Okay, well, at that point, once that decision's been made, the government has created the $2 trillion necessary to deficit spend, just by deciding to do so. That's how it's done. There's no tax dollars involved. There's no loans from China involved. The government, the Congress just simply creates this budget, and once it's signed into law, the money has been manufactured. Every time the government spends, it's a brand new dollar. And every time it taxes, every time, those dollars exit the banking system. They're destroyed. They go bye-bye. Bye-bye now. They leave the spreadsheet. They're gone forever. They leave the economy, never to come back again. Okay? If you want them back, the government has to spend again. So it's going to have to use a keyboard and through keystrokes, type numbers. So we have the US Treasury for that. Here's the US Treasury. This box. That's exactly what it looks like too. It's just a square. If you go to Washington, you'll see the square. That's the US Treasury. Okay. Anyway. So, once Congress has settled on that budget, it orders Treasury to begin spending. How does it do that? Well, certain people have to be paid in order to fund certain agendas, like, you know, a defense contractor, they've got to be paid, you know. Everybody has a private bank account, you know, they have their individual bank account. The Treasury begins crediting bank accounts. It begins dispersing the newly created dollars by keystrokes. All right. The problem, though, is Steve Grumbine here is owed $10,000. He's down here. Here's Steve Grumbine, good old SG. And he has a bank account at Chase. Okay? So, Steve Grumbine has an individual bank account at Chase. There's Chase Bank. Here's US Treasury. You notice there's this big gap in the middle? There's nothing here. Just this empty space. What do you think goes there, Stephen? What should be the next box that I should put here? In between US Treasury and Chase.
The Fed?
Yeah, the creature from Jekyll Island. It goes here. Yes, okay. So, I'm going to put a rectangle here, okay? And I'm going to put the word Fed here. There it is. This is the Fed.
I just don't have a fetish. That's the problem.
That's okay. We'll get you one. I know some girls that have a fetish. I know some guys that have a fetish too. All right. So, here's the Fed. It's a nation's central bank. Okay? This square here is the Fed, and this is a reserve account. This real rectangle here is what we call a reserve account, and Chase has one at the Federal Reserve. So as we can see this little arrow, Chase is attached to the Federal Reserve System. Okay? And there's Steve Grumbine. He's got his little Chase bank account. He's happy. And the government's going to give him $10,000. Let's see how it does that. And we're going to use green. The US Treasury credits Steve Grumbine's account with $10,000. So Steve Grumbine's account goes up by $10,000 at Chase. There it goes. But the Fed, at the same time, puts $10,000 into Chase's reserve account. So when the US Treasury spends, it causes reserves to rise in the system. This is very important because we're going to, when it deficit spends, that is, it's going to cause reserves to rise in the system. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But here's Steve Grumbine's $10,000 that the US Treasury credited to his account. And now the Fed has injected $10,000 into Chase's reserve account. The Fed does this so that when Steve begins to spend this money, the payments will clear. Anybody understand what I mean by that? If you swipe a debit card or write a check and you give it to somebody else and they deposit it, that payment has to clear. Okay? That bank, that other person's bank has to have enough money in their reserve account to clear that payment. All right. So over here is Steve's $10,000, and up here in Chase's reserve account at the Fed, and I'm going to make this point very clear before we get any deeper into the Fed. Reserve accounts are held at the Fed. The dollars in reserve accounts never leave the Fed. They don't wander off into the economy like fleas, okay? They stay in those reserve accounts under lock and key. They're actually on a spreadsheet. The Federal Reserve controls everything. Banks don't use them to take vacations to the Caribbean. That's not what they're there for. They're there to clear payments. So, as the US government begins deficit spending, reserves rise. As the US Treasury credits individual bank accounts, the Fed makes sure the payment's clear by injecting what we call high-powered money into reserve accounts, or US dollars. And the reserves rise. That's when we're deficit spending. Okay, so let's watch now how the reserves work. I'm going to write this out. I'm going to create another bank here, Bank of America. We'll just call it BOA. BOA, yeah. There, that little square. And we're going to add another rectangle. Okay. Here's Bank of America's reserve account. Okay. And we're at the Fed still. Okay. We're at the Preacher from Jekyll Island here. Now, over here in Chase's account, Chase's reserve account, there's $10,000. Steve Grumbine's numbers in his individual bank account read $10,000. Now, Steve is going to buy something with a check from someone who has a bank account at Bank of America. Now, watch. Very simple. Steve spends the $5,000 by writing a check. So he writes $5,000, and suddenly his bank account drops by $5,000. So now he has $5,000. His numbers in his bank account automatically go from $10,000 to $5,000. The numbers are just marked down. But now watch what happens up here at Chase's reserve account. The same thing occurs. And $5,000 moves over into Bank of America's account, and whoever he bought something from, when they deposit that check, they get $5,000. Their numbers in their bank account rise by $5,000. So what happens is, Grumbine spends $5,000 on something. The reserves in Chase's bank reserve account shift to Bank of America's by $5,000. There you go. Once was $10,000, now it's $5,000. So what's over here in Steve Grumbine's account, and whoever he bought whatever from at Bank of America, there's 5,000 numbers. This is simply a reflection of the claim that Steve Grumbine has on his bank's reserve. In other words, he has 5,000 on deposit. Up here it sits in the reserve account, and they shift back and forth. Every time you swipe a debit card, the numbers in your bank's reserve account shift to another bank's reserve account. And the shifting continues unabated, if I can pump this. There are so many reserve accounts. Banks have various reserve accounts at the Federal Reserve. And dollars are constantly shifting back and forth all the time between reserve accounts. See that? They're just going back and forth all day, every day. Because people are buying things. Reserves, dollars just keep flipping back and forth between various banks' reserve accounts. Okay? That's so that payments will clear. The purpose of the Federal Reserve is to ensure that those payments will clear. So whenever the government is spending, whenever the US Treasury is spending, when it's deficit spending, banks' reserve accounts are rising. So individual bank accounts. And when individuals spend those dollars, they just simply shift back and forth at the Federal Reserve. They never vacate the Federal Reserve. They never leave the Federal Reserve. We understand that so far? These dollars in reserve accounts never leave the Federal Reserve. They just stay there. Okay? And they shift back and forth. Now, Chase, right, might through daily transactions, have at some point come short of reserves. Bank of America might. Individual banks might go a bit short of reserves and have to go seek them on the interbank market or whatnot. But the system itself is never short of reserves. Banks cannot create US dollars, and banks cannot destroy US dollars. Only the Fed can do that. And what did we say at the beginning of this? We said that the Board of Governors was an agency of the federal government. Oh my God! Okay, isn't that fantastic? So the Fed here operates on a public mandate. It must stand ready to make sure the payment system clears and all this stability. And when we get to bank lending, you're going to understand why. You know, back to the payment system, like we said. But point being is that these dollars never vacate the Fed. They remain on spreadsheets and just bounce back and forth between reserve accounts.
But Ellis, good question came up. Perfect 101 question. What if Steve wants cash for his dollars versus a debit card or whatever electronic transfer might be there?
Sure. If Steve wants to do that, guess what he does? He goes to his bank. He walks up to the teller. Why they call it a teller, I don't know. Call it a dictator. I'm going to tell you how it is, sir. Okay. Anyway, go up to the teller, and he presents his little account thing there, and he says, "Hi, I'd like to withdraw $20. Okay. I'd like that. Just a $20 bill, please." So the teller dips into the bank's vault and hands him $20 in cash. The question is, where did the bank get the cash? Excellent one-on-one question. Now we're going to answer that. And we'll get back to this, don't worry, because we're going to talk about bank lending. I'm going to erase this for now. But we understand, before I get into this cash thing, we understand that the US dollar is manufactured when Congress determines a budget, and then Treasury begins crediting individual bank accounts, and the Fed makes sure that those payments will clear.
Hey, Ellis, just for grins and giggles, make sure you use the number $10,000 for your cash in Grumbine's hand.
Why is that important?
It is to Wayne, I think. Wade, so I want to make sure we address it.
Okay, 10,000. But anyway, so we got to this question now. Where did paper currency come from? What's so damn special about it? Nothing. But Steve wants $20 in cash. He goes to his bank and says, "I want to withdraw $20 in cash out of my $10,000 I have on deposit." They say, okay. Teller goes in the vault, dips in there, gives him a $20 bill, off he goes. What's happened? How did the bank get that $20? Well, remember what we talked about. Let's assume, once again, he banks at Chase, because that's where he was, so why break precedent? Here's the Fed. Okay, Chase is connected to the Federal Reserve System. Here's Steve Grumbine. He's got his little account there. He wants his $20 now. Okay, here's what happens and how Chase gets that cash. Remember what we said? When Grumbine got his $10,000 from the government, $10,000 was deposited into Chase's reserve account by the Fed. So there it is, okay? Now, let's say Chase doesn't have $20 cash on hand and says, "Oh, darn it. Got to give Steve his $20, so he's going to have to wait a little while." So Steve's going to wait a couple of days to get his $20. But here's what happens. Chase says, I need cash because my customers are demanding cash. So it lets the Fed know, I need $20 in cash. All right, well, what the Fed will do is check to make sure that Chase has at least the $20 in its reserve account. And when it sees that it does, okay, it'll take $20 and delete it from here. Okay? So 9980. The Fed will simply mark down the numbers in Chase's reserve account from 10,000 to 9,980. And then, guess what it does? If it doesn't have the cash on hand, okay, it calls up the U.S. Treasury's Bureau of Engraving and Printing, not the Fed. See, the Fed doesn't print the money. All right. So it calls up the U.S. Treasury Bureau of Engraving and Printing and says, oh my, we need some cash. It's a holiday season, you know. So the Bureau of Engraving and Printing prints off the Federal Reserve notes and ships them directly to the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, which then get the cash to the commercial banks that demand it. But basically, how we're looking at it is how the Fed gets the $20 cash when Chase needs it. It contacts the Fed. Fed says, okay, you want 20 bucks? It marks down the original 10,000 that was in its reserve account down 20 bucks. There we go. And then it ships $20 in cash to Chase. Okay. What once was the number 20 in Chase's reserve account has now become the physical piece of paper that says 20. Okay? And that is what cash is. Cash is the physical manifestation of a number that was issued by the government. When the Treasury deficit spent and the reserves rose in Chase's reserve account there, okay, Chase then ordered the cash. The Fed marked down the numbers in the reserve account by how much cash it needed, and then shipped the cash to Chase, and there it sits. So the number 20 that was once here, just a number on a spreadsheet, has now become a piece of paper that Steve Grumbine can put in his pocket, and he can take it out in the middle of the road in a busy night, on a busy road, and wave it downtown and say, look, I have $20. And everybody would believe it. That's all cash is. Cash is just a physical manifestation of a number that used to sit in a reserve account that was created at will by the U.S. government when it's spent. The U.S. government itself does not require cash to fund its spending. So when you hear the government going out and spending $1 trillion for an airplane, it doesn't call up the U.S. Treasury's Bureau of Engraving and Printing and say, oh, crank out $1 trillion in cash so we can buy this airplane. It doesn't do that. All right, it just simply types numbers. The reason why cash exists is because Steve Grumbine demanded the crap. He went to his bank and he said, I want 20 bucks in cash right now. That's why. Cash is based on bank customer demand for cash. That's it. And whenever banks need more cash, and they're busy, like we said, at the holiday season, it's very busy, they might need more cash, so they order it from the Fed. The Fed has it printed by the U.S. Treasury. U.S. Treasury distributes it to the Federal Reserve banks. The banks then get a hold of the cash and they stick them in their vault. In other words, the numbers that they used to hold in their reserve accounts, they're now holding as paper cash in vaults. They don't get to keep the $20 in reserves and get an extra $20 in their vault. Doesn't work that way. So the Fed will mark down the reserves. Again, if the Fed had $2 million in his reserve account here, and Chase said, I need $2 million in cash, it would mark down the reserve account by $2 million and ship $2 million cash. And if Chase sent back $1 million cash to the Fed because it had too much cash, the Fed would just mark up Chase's reserve account by $1 million and take the cash out.
Thanks for joining us. What did you think about what you just saw? You know, what do you think about Ellis and Steve discussing modern monetary theory? Did you have any questions? You know, this was only part 1. Part 2 is going to come next week. Again, it was a long episode back in the day when it was first recorded and broadcast. You know, trying to make things a little bit more easily digestible this way. But what do you think about what you heard so far? Please share this around. We need to start having these conversations with people. We need to start getting people to understand that it's not sufficient to have a series of policy goals. You have to know how you're going to go about paying for these things, how you're going to finance them. And the way that we've been discussing financing has been massively the reason why we don't get the policies. Everyone knows we need single-payer healthcare. I don't know anyone that says that's not the goal, but so many of them want to go incrementally. because they think it's going to be complicated and expensive. It's going to be expensive, and they think that they're going to be the ones that are going to flip the bill. We need to be able to put this shit to rest so we can stop talking about what we want and start implementing the things that we want. The entirety of my lifetime and beyond has been the discussion about getting a single-payer healthcare system in the United States. And it keeps getting beaten back and beaten back and beaten back by people who want to be able to profit off of your sickness. And the only way they can come up with to make sure that they do profit off of your sickness is to keep you ignorant about how money works, about how the financial system of this country and most other countries actually operate, so that you do feel like you're going to be the one that's going to be financing everything. That's a pretty easy and awful way to make us fight amongst ourselves while we suffer and die. So let's stop doing that, shall we? Be back next week with part 2 of Alice and Steve. Good night.